Listeners are advised that the following podcast episode does discuss situations around grief and trauma that can be triggering to some people. Listener discretion is advised. On this episode, I talk with Skye about the complexities of grief, trauma, and growth. Skye helped develop SCIA's Engage program as part of our broader resilience programs. Engage helps people at any stage of their spinal cord injury find meaning and purpose.
I'm Skye. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been working with a whole range of people with chronic health conditions for a number of years. I've worked in the acute and rehab wards of the major spinal cord injury units in Sydney, Australia, and I've also worked running group programs in a chronic pain setting.
We're going to talk about the different ways people manifest pain and trauma, and why the way we deal with pain and trauma in terms of disability is a lot more than the disability itself. We recorded this episode across the magic of the internet, so you may hear some background sounds like the occasional beeping, but I feel like if anything, it just adds to the authenticity and atmos of it all.
If you think about it broadly, trauma is just a state of heightened arousal. So it's usually an event or events in which a person feels threatened. The experience of trauma can overwhelm a person's ability to cope. When they think about a traumatic incident, they think of that single incident trauma that's associated with a terrifying or life-threatening event. You know, people can experience single incident trauma through a bushfire or flood or sexual or physical assault. So thinking and feeling-wise, avoidance symptoms and hyperarousal. But I guess what I'm really interested in is not just that single incident trauma, but what we call complex PTSD. And that originated actually in the late 80s and 90s from the leading author called Judith Herman, who wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery. What complex trauma means: traumatic events, usually of an interpersonal nature. So it's usually relational.
People don't come into complex trauma with a blank slate. There are so many other factors at play when discussing the complexities of trauma.
Complex trauma, the central feature is that it occurs between people. It's an interpersonal form of trauma. I'm just thinking about the work that I've done in the spinal wards, and as a clinical psychologist, I'm in this very unique and privileged role of hearing kind of the intimate levels of pain and suffering, and also areas of hope and resilience in people that normally people don't get to hear or get exposed to. Some of the themes that I remember from my time there, without being too specific about the people that I have seen, is really any traumatic injury really impacts your kind of connection to your body. So often people do feel in that acute stage initially quite disconnected from their body and their identity as a person. So, you know, if you have this view of yourself, of the trajectory that you're going, any form of trauma, especially if it impacts your physicality, can very much just leave you feeling alienated and isolated. And there's often all sorts of ways to then cope with that. So people can put on this brave face, they can resist it, suppress it, they can feel very angry, or they can feel envy or a sort of resentment of other people's lives, or fantasies about the person that they were on the previous trajectory. But on the other hand, they can also feel really guilty and a lot of shame and or frustration for not positively, adjusting.
Think about how you process good and bad situations. Is it exactly the same as everyone else? I doubt it. Skye talks about how we need to acknowledge that everyone has their own pace when it comes to grief and how they process that.
Not everyone is ready when we want them to be. So people, depending on their histories, may not be ready early on to speak about the enormity of their losses or the impact. They may have to just focus in that initial stage on the rehab, on walking again, even though a few years down the track, that might not at all be the goal, yes, but it takes time and working with yourself in a way in processing the emotional pain. And if you don't feel ready for it, it might just be, in a way, that very simple analogy of the Coke bottle. You just want to, instead of bottling it all in, shaking it all up, you just want to twist that little lid little bit at a time, however much you feel ready, just to let some air out. And that can be in all sorts of ways. There are hundreds of different techniques out there, or smorgasbord of self-soothing, self-regulation tools. But I think one of the most important is just recognizing your own pain, and to know that being human and alive exposes you to the experience of pain. And so pain isn't really the problem. It's your relationship, really, with your pain. This is emotional or physical pain. How you do or don't make space for that pain, or harshly judge or fight that pain. That's what makes the difference. Acceptance doesn't mean resignation or a passive sense of sort of helplessness. So leaning into it, so acceptance can be very loaded, that term, for people, but leaning into that pain is almost sort of like understanding the notion that grief can't be hurried. There's no quick fix. There's no right way. So, or a prescribed cure. Yeah. So it's about containing it, recognizing it for what it is, and I guess realizing that adjustment and new learning just can't be hurried. If you think about the nature of our brains, there's a lot of hope in this space of trauma, because we know fundamentally, on an evolutionary level and on a neurobiological level, co-regulation, it mitigates distress. What that means is our relationships with people, we can form healthy attachments later in life if we're able to put into words our painful experiences in the presence of another person. That can relieve it.
If you have already decided that you're going to open up that Coke bottle a little bit at a time to try and let the air out, and you've started talking about things with different people in your life and people who you have trusted, then what happens if, like, you've talked about things with other people and those people are not responding in a way that you have you half expected them to, or you're not finding that they are taking it seriously as you would have liked them to take it?
I hear this very frequently in my private practice, because people don't, as a society in general, we don't allow permission to grieve. It's not easy for others, especially in existing dynamics that you may have had before the trauma, or just generally in life, to adjust. When you make shifts in your own ability to begin to open up to pain, to give yourself time and space to adjust, other people are not necessarily doing the same. So in a way, loss brings change. And it is a tricky one, because relationships is probably one of the biggest areas of concern for people with disability in general, and also with spinal cord injury. It's such a huge area of importance, and being sure of who you are and attending to your needs.
When discussing the complexities of trauma, we have to address the all too common theme of almost an overemphasis for people with disabilities to push through the difficulties and become heroic in a way. Not just for them, but it's almost like it's for everybody else. However, this can be fraught with its own problems. When people have disabilities, children, I think I see this the most in maybe children or people who have had like traumatic disabilities of some kind or something like that. When the community gets around them, there is like this thing where people are like, you can do it. Like it's almost like they are so enthusiastic with all the right intentions. So they have this over expectation that people with disabilities are going to be achieving beyond what they were capable of whatever, either they had that disability their whole lives or their old self. They would have never put this, like they would have never been like this to somebody who was their able-bodied lives.
It's so much pressure on both ends to carry out this inspirational role, or just to positively adjust, to keep doing what the plan says, or what is written on paper to get XYZ goal. And that is generally in the biomedical model how you work. You have to achieve XYZ transfers or independence before you leave the hospital, and then even outside of that, more and more. And people can get caught up in that. In a way, it can give people a general sense of meaning and purpose, but the other extremity, like you talked about, is also very disempowering. And the idea that it is easy to think in black and white terms about everything. It is easy to dichotomize things. In a way, when we suffer a trauma, we can revert back to what's simplest. And a lot of systems that are stuck in that black and white model of being, rather than acknowledging the complexities of individual experiences, it is problematic. So the more I practice in this area, the more I realize how different everyone is and how you cannot generalize really about anything, and that each individual has to come to terms with their path. How do you rewrite the trajectory that you thought you were going to go on, or that you have been on from a very young age? How do you reorganize, rewrite that, and find still strands of yourself, but in this new version? There's this rhetoric in our society that we have to be doing well, have to be battling disease. And that can be really harmful, because at the end of the day, it really leaves people feeling extremely unable to express their vulnerability, and then isolated, and even at times demoralized or quite existentially distressed. It can be even a low level of underlying just hopelessness. It's not easy. I think the people that I've seen in the hospital setting who tend to struggle, but not always initially, are either those who are very closed off from their own experiences of trauma, or have a history of it, and it's been now activated by this new incident that has set off sort of whole range of triggers in feeling so defenseless. Openly talking about vulnerability to destigmatize sort of the range of emotional experiences that all human beings feel that doesn't just include positivity and resilience and adjustment. It also includes grief and loss and pain and processing of that. That's the way forward. On the spinal cord injury level, it's also the systems that are built in place. If you think about a hospital system and where it originally came from. A hospital system came out of sort of a military, fighting mode. And so from the moment that you have an injury or you go into the hospital system, in a way, they're trying to get you good enough to pump you out again. Not to say that, of course, we need these systems, but I guess the struggle is for people to kind of in these settings and systems initially to acknowledge that they're humans who feel deeply vulnerable and lacking in control when you're completely defenseless, and there's this terror in the level of dependency, this newfound level of dependency that you have to adjust to, and it takes time. It's a systemic issue. And I think opening up conversations, using language to put experiences of pain into words, and for someone else to hear that, whether it's, someone that you're close to or a health professional, that's one of the most powerful ways of healing from trauma and grief and loss. Trauma itself, evidence shows it's best processed when you feel safe and stable, so not in that acute or even that initial community setting where you're still adjusting. So when you feel safe and secure, then you can go into that process of understanding, what brings you meaning and purpose, who you are as a person, and how you can go about setting boundaries for yourself that you feel align with your own needs and values. And that's not a sort of simple one-day task. This is sort of a lifetime sort of event or series of events to process this. I mean, I wouldn't be doing what I do if I didn't have hope that people can reorganize, rewrite their paths that's disrupted by loss. And over time, it's something that everybody can develop, setting firmer boundaries once you know your own needs.
If you've got a society or you've got a community that's over-expecting or under-expecting of you, these things can also impact how you act on yourself and how you act to the outside world later on down the track, even if it's unrelated to your disability.
Absolutely. It puts the onus or responsibility on the person who is suffering. And that is the greatest burden to hold, whether it's a spinal cord injury or, a disability from birth. Society is not designed for people in wheelchairs. But I guess what's important also is just knowing that it's not your responsibility to make others constantly feel better or to educate others. Yeah, that you're not an endless source of inspiration. That's not your life purpose from birth. Yeah, and you don't have to, in a way, explain yourself. So it might be just really, again, getting in touch with your own needs, your own values, and knowing what gives you a sense of flow, whether that is just in a day-to-day sort of setting, nature. There could be just periods of time that help you self-regulate and give you space to just be with yourself. And sometimes in the oddest of moments, when you are just with yourself, allowing yourself to come down into this zone which we call the window of tolerance, meaning you can tolerate both thinking and feeling at the same time. You're not in that hyper-aroused zone of threat. These are all the effects of trauma, that you're chronically elevated in the state of hyper-arousal or hypo or under-arousal. So the more you can stay in that middle zone, which we call the window of tolerance, which sometimes is so toothpick thin, the more you can, I guess, be committed to giving yourself permission to set certain boundaries and to communicate.
We should probably talk about if somebody is out there struggling and they just haven't given themselves a chance to look after their mental health. It's for everybody, right?
Sometimes taking that step initially is sort of the hardest step of all, because you're changing, in a way, sometimes entire belief systems around who you are. So it's not easy to take that first step, to pick up that phone, or to even do some research on who you might want to try out. The association that I would recommend for people is the Australian Clinical Psychology Association, where they have a tool where you can find a clinical psychologist close to you in your area who might specialise in a certain area. But just coming back to your question, taking that first step is really important. Sitting in the room and getting a feel for that interaction. Like, it's also important to recognise that you're in control of that. You just want someone to be able to stay in the room with you with all their skills, but also as a human being, able to listen to your pain and not put that back to you, but contain it.
What are some strategies that people can take on if they're feeling like they're a little bit disconnected from themselves and they're just trying to find themselves? You said earlier, try and find something that you like doing, or some mindfulness training, or is there anything else that we should be keeping in mind?
I guess there are a whole host of strategies that you can use to help you regulate your mind and body. Mindfulness, we know, has a lot of evidence behind it for a practice that's ancient. Didn't really require the evidence, but we've now got a lot of evidence for the impact it can have on emotional pain and chronic physical pain too. So mindfulness or meditation is something that's very powerful, but if that is too difficult, and it can be quite triggering for some people to sit with that, mindfulness doesn't encompass, if you think about that formal meditation of just, being with yourself for 10 or 20 minutes. It doesn't have to be that. It can just be doing an activity that you enjoy in a mindful way, in a very present, focused way. And that could be, like I said, connecting with nature, connecting to an exercise or sport that you like, but really focusing on your actions, etc. Or even savouring just everyday moments, like the colour of a leaf or the smell of a flower, just really integrating that into your day, yeah? And making sure you make space, because I think everybody these days in our society is busy, overstimulated by dopamine from alerts from phones. It's very hard to take yourself off into a space to go, I'm just going to be with myself, yeah? And so making that space is vital in order to just allow for that processing of grief. You can go for years overworking or stimulated. Sometimes what a spinal cord injury or any disability does is force you to be with yourself, yeah, in a new way. And ultimately, post-traumatic growth can occur, but it can only occur after you allow yourself to grieve, or in parallel to grieving. It doesn't just happen in that inspirational way. You have to allow yourself to feel the full facets.
You said something interesting around a constant dopamine hit of being always on. Your phone's going off. I know my phone's gone off like 3 times during this interview. We're on a computer now doing this interview, but emails are coming through, all this other stuff. And then you've got television. If somebody is trying to distract themselves by putting as many things in their faces as possible, they're just getting all that all at the same time, rather than just, I guess, sitting and like you said, taking time to do an activity where you're focusing on that activity. It's just yours and yours alone. What can happen to people who are trying to basically, I guess what I'm asking is, if people are trying to constantly distract themselves by tech or whatever, instead of taking time out for themselves, what can happen? What can be some of the ramifications?
I guess, firstly, we're all part of this society now where there's a strong drive system operating at all times, yeah? It's motivating us to get that dopamine hit, to check that phone, check that email. During lockdown, it's impossible not to have something still online, yeah? And there's an evolutionary psychologist called Paul Gilbert, and he proposed this model where we have 3 regulation systems. One of them is the drive system that's sort of overactive, hyperdrive. And we also have a threat system, which the purpose of it is to detect and protect ourselves from, danger. And I guess that's the amygdala. That's the part of the brain that processes fear and is related to cortisol. That's probably heightened as well when you're in this constant drive system. There is this threat of missing out. When these two are overreactive, the third system that's proposed, which is a soothing system, is sort of like a shriveled up prune. And the soothing system is the one that, if you think about the cave, if you think about a community, you come in at night to eat, to soothe each other, bond, and manage the distress of the day around the fire. And that's the prefrontal cortex operating. That's our frontal lobes, the sort of CEOs of our brains. And it's related to oxytocin, the love hormone that's released when you give birth and bond with your child. And it helps us feel safe and protected and cared for. So that system, unfortunately, just generally, I think, and this goes for everyone, can be underdeveloped. So anything that allows you to achieve a state of flow, or what that means is sort of immersion into an activity that's just challenging enough, that's probably something to, if you don't have that already, to kind of think about or strive for. So, you can't really get into that flow state by watching TV passively. It's sort of a state that's talked about when you're just immersed in some activity, and that's different for everyone. There are hundreds, so it's hard to recommend one. But, if you think about what works for you, whether that is, a sport or something usually to do with your body, really building that soothing system would be important.
You described it as the CEO of the brain, which I love. I guess that really affects, there is long-term negative effects around building those sorts of habits.
Another good author, if you wanted to do some self-learning, is Dan Siegel. He's written a lot around sort of the parts of the brain. And if you think about the brain, it can broadly be divided up to that upstairs brain or the frontal lobe, which is involved in everything to do with decision-making, empathy, play, your ability to be curious and playful, and controls executive functioning. And then that's switched off when that downstairs part, the amygdala, is firing out of control. That's the fear center. So a spinal cord injury or a disability is inherently a fear-activating condition. You constantly, 24 hours a day in a way, especially when you initially are faced with the helplessness and the intrusiveness of people coming into your personal space, and an inability to complete sort of tasks for yourself. That's a constant threat response. So it's, I think, also sometimes a little bit too demanding, this system that we've spoken about in sort of the beginning. It's just too much demand to expect a person to be okay. When you're initially encountering a massive, and I mean initially, not just in the first week or first month, but probably the research says first 2 years, you will just generally accept that, you will be in this stress response. But then afterwards or during it, learning to help activate that shriveled up soothing response, and then eventually building a little rhythm in your life where you make that space to find the not just activities but the people that can help you co-regulate. If you think about that warm community of that fire in the cave, it's the attachments that you form that can have a huge difference too.
So what sort of boundaries should people be setting so they don't become because you said something incredibly interesting around somebody does not have the capacity to be able to do everyday tasks in the same way able-bodied people do. They will need help and assistance, which puts them instantly into a defense mode or like this fear type mode. And so that can instantly, because a lot of people who have spinal cord injuries, they need help beginning of the day, end of the day. So they start their day off in this fight or flight mode, and then they end their day in a fight or flight mode. And that can be, and then I guess the continual build up of having that every day
Absolutely.
would just one day reach a precipice, and then it will just affect everything. And that's just one example, I guess. Let's not say that that's the only example. It's just one example of something that can happen. So what sort of boundaries should we be giving ourselves to try and regulate it back down so we can go into that soothing mindset? Not mindset, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that brings up for me so much of the horror of what I've heard of people having to go through, just sort of quite inhumane amounts of suffering based on the fact that there's not enough, again, the finite resource thing, or that there's just, it is hard. I can say to you, look, the ideal situation would be to build a safe team around you, a group of people whom you feel safe with, whom you feel you can trust and kind of empower you from, in all facets of your life. But that's not easy. People are transient too, especially I know carers, you have a good one and very practical level, they can move on and you have no control over that. So it's very, very difficult. And I would say in those moments, which are inevitable, that's sort of the fundamental thing, that you think, okay, suffering is inevitable. So there will be moments in the future where I will be triggered, and I will be triggered into a state where I feel more dysregulated, where I might feel more of that heightened fear, more of a need to control. I can come back to the one thing that's constant, which is my breath, which is right now calming down that activation of that stress or threat response, because I know that when my frontal lobe comes back online, it can help me think and make decisions and have empathy for people around me. So let me just do that for myself first. So always the number one goal is just fill your cup, to make sure you have enough fuel in the tank, so to speak. And once you have that, once you have some of those brain processes operating again that help you make decisions and plan, then you're on track. You know, there are many techniques for that, but I think coming ultimately back to your breathing and your body, your senses, they are very helpful, because, you know, we know in trauma there's a famous saying, the body keeps the score. So even though your mind might be okay, your body remembers. So trying to regulate that body through just using your 5 senses to calm down your breathing, that can help.
Do you have anything else that you would like to add before we wrap things up?
I guess I'd just like to thank you for having this podcast. I went through all your episodes and it's fascinating, and it's something that I wish when I started working in this area existed, so that I could immediately send that link to people, because these conversations are vital and it's so important. And I think just, you know, the intimate nature of hearing you speak to people who've been through so much pain, you know, it can help people feel less alone and isolated.
That's the aim of the game, Skye. It doesn't matter if you're in rural somewhere, Australia or some other country. This podcast, our second highest followership is the United States, followed by the United Kingdom. Everybody experiences kind of very similar, if not the same experiences, no matter where you are in this situation. So, yeah.
Pain is universal, suffering is universal. Yeah, there's such a lack of community. You can feel very much alone in your own space when you first go through any trauma, whether that is a spinal cord injury or disability. And I think if you can build that sense of community for people, what you're doing is facilitating an environment where people can be heard, and maybe eventually linking people up in some form.
You've been listening to Have the Nerve, a podcast by Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. This episode has been written, produced and edited by me, Susan Wood, and logo art by Cobie Ann Moore. SCIA has many ways you can socially connect with the wider community. We have a peer and family support team that supports people with a spinal cord injury in the spinal units and in the community. We have team members in Sydney, Perth, Canberra and Northern Rivers, New South Wales. As I said in the beginning, SCIA also has resilience programs for people who want to find meaning, purpose, and work on mental health and well-being. Check the show notes below to find the details of these programs, our team, and anything we've discussed in this episode. This episode has been funded by the Australian Government Department of Social Services as part of the Resource Hub. You can pay it a visit at scia.org.au. And finally, as usual, if you like this episode and Have the Nerve as a podcast, give us, me, a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And feel free to tell absolutely everybody about this episode. Thank you for listening.